You wake up, happy, hungry, and thirsty. Your tail is wagging at maximum speed. You get up and stretch, lick your lips, and turn around to go get a drink of water. But something catches your eye, and you stop dead in your tracks. Your owner is looking at you with a craze in his eyes. You suddenly become anxious and start shaking. Immediately, he smiles and charges at you yelling, "Red Rocket." You are stunned, terrified, and he does the unthinkable. And to make it even worse, he records it. You are Israel Adesanya's dog, and this is the Casual's Guide to Israel Adesanya vs. Nassourdine Imavov. The first fighter we will be looking at today is Nassourdine Imavov. He was born on March 1st, 1995, to an ethnic Kumyk family in Dagestan, Russia. At the age of 9, Imavov moved with his family to Salon de Provence, France, where he started boxing. After that, he discovered MMA, and at 19, he moved to Paris with his older brother, Damir, where they joined Fernandez Lopez's MMA factory, which is a huge gym that trains fighters such as Cyril Gane, Ion Cutelaba, Veronica Hardy, and Cedric Doumbé, as well as many other good fighters. Imavov also stands at a staggering 6'3", which is pretty tall for middleweight. Nassourdine started his MMA career in the professionals. He made his MMA debut in February of 2016 against Majdeddine Ayada. This would be a huge test for a fighter making his debut, because Ayada already had an impressive 7 wins and 3 losses. Nassourdine also started his career at welterweight. This fight would turn out to be too much for the inexperienced Imavov, and he would find himself stuck in a guillotine choke and forced to tap at the end of the first round. This was a huge blow to Imavov's ego, but this would mean he already got his first loss out of the way and wouldn't feel the pressure of keeping his perfect record. Imavov would waste no time in testing himself once more. He would sign his second fight in March of that same year, fighting Said Nurmagomedov. Imavov would come out with a fire lit under him and prove to the world that he could make it as a professional, and he would do just that by piecing Said up and taking him down and getting his back, therefore sinking in a beautiful rear naked choke and getting the submission finish in the first round just 3 minutes in. After getting his first win, he would remain very active and sign up to fight just 1 month later in April. This time he would be fighting Yanis Turfa. This would turn out to be a very similar fight to his previous one, dominating Yanis and fighting a crazy Bravo choke just 2 minutes into the first round. He would end up taking the rest of the year off to hang out and enjoy the fruits of his labor, as well as help his team train and sharpen his own tools. In May of 2017, he would walk into that beautiful octagon once again, this time fighting Paul Lawrence. This would be yet another first round finish, and he would get the TKO finish just 2 minutes in. Imavov would take his time and have a full training camp, eventually fighting again in October of that same year, this time fighting Michael Michalski. This would be by far harder than any of his previous fights, but he would showcase his cardio and his striking, but he would end up losing this fight in a decision loss. This was nothing but a bump in the road for the still budding prospect. Imavov would want to stay active and get back into the win column. He would fight again just 1 month later in November of that same year. This time his opponent would be Gary Formosa, and he would starch Gary just 2 minutes into the fight, getting the knockout in the very first round. This was a huge win for Imavov, and he would end up taking more than a year off to sharpen his game, as well as his teammates. Fast forward to May of 2019, Imavov would fight once again, this time fighting Gregor Weibel. This would be a back and forth scrap with crazy moments on the feet, as well as fun scrambles. But Imavov would win the majority of the exchanges, therefore he would get his hand raised when the ref read the scorecards. Nassourdine Imavov would end up fighting just 2 months later in July, this time facing off with Francisco de Montes. This is where Imavov would make his middleweight debut as well. This would be a one-sided beatdown that left one man fresh as a daisy and the other fast asleep, catching some Z's after Imavov sunk in a nasty rear naked choke just 2 minutes into the fight. After going on a 3-fight win streak and getting some momentum going, and his first loss far behind him, he would fight again in September of 2019. This time he was set to trade knuckles with Mateusz Gluch for the TFL welterweight belt, but it would be less of trading hands and more trying to rip Gluch's arm clean off his body after sinking in a Kimura in the first round, getting the finish and his first and only belt wrapped around his waist. Many lesser fighters would have taken the rest of the year off, but Nassourdine was hyped up and wanted to fight again as soon as possible. He would get his wish answered and would fight again in December of that same year, this time fighting Jonathan Muner. This would turn out to be yet another one-sided bullying session, with Nassourdine getting the TKO finish in the first round once again. Nassourdine was gaining hype all around France and other surrounding countries. The whispers would get all the way to the biggest promotion in the world, the UFC, and they would skip the usual testing grounds and have him fight on a UFC card immediately. In October of 2020, Imavov would take his first big step into making his dreams come true. His opponent would be Jordan Williams. This is where he would make his delighted return to middleweight. With the light shining bright and the ref saying fight, Imavov would showcase his extremely high level of striking, dismantling Williams time after time. This fight would go all 3 rounds and Imavov would win by unanimous decision. After winning his long-awaited UFC debut, Imavov would fight again in February of 2021, stepping up to fight an up-and-coming Phil Hawes. This would be a spectacular fight that once again would test both men. However, no one would end up getting the finish, so it would go to the judges to decide the winner, and Phil Hawes would get the nod from the judges. Imavov had gotten his first loss in the UFC, but it is important to remember just how good Phil Hawes was. Outside of his chin being super weak, Phil had phenomenal striking and a great ground game. If he didn't have one of the worst chins in the UFC, he would be a legit problem in the division. But a loss is a loss, and Nassourdine took it in stride. Imavov would take his next fight just a few months later in July of 2021. His opponent would be a newcomer, Ian Heinisch. Imavov was the favorite going into this fight, and for good reason, because once the ref said fight, it would be a one-sided smackdown that left Ian battered and bruised, with the ref stepping in to stop the fight in the second round and Imavov getting the TKO win once again. Imavov would stay busy and fight once more in 2021 in November. He would get matched up with Ronda Rousey's prodigy, Edmund Shabazian, who was ranked number 15. Many thought Edmund would knock out Imavov, but others saw how good he was, so it was a toss-up. But once the fight happened, it was clear as day who was the better fighter. That man was Nassourdine Imavov, because in the second round, he would land brutal ground and pound elbows that left Edmund defenseless, and the ref stopped the fight, getting Imavov the TKO win yet again for the second time in a row. Imavov would take the rest of the year off, as well as most of 2022, eventually finding a matchup in September of 2022 against another star with one of the biggest knockouts in UFC history, Jaquan Buckley. This fight was another banger, with both men landing hard shots and going back and forth in the grappling exchanges. But Nassourdine had gotten the better of the exchanges the longer the fight went. And once the last bell rang, it was no question that he had done more than enough to get the unanimous decision win. With the momentum building, as well as getting closer and closer to the championship belt, Nassourdine would fight a former champion and fan favorite, Sean Strickland. But this was a weird build-up because Nassourdine was supposed to fight Kelvin Gastelum, but he had to pull out on fight week. But Strickland would step in with the condition that he could fight at light heavyweight. Imavov had already made it close to 185 pounds, so he agreed and stopped cutting weight. Overall, he would walk into this fight 194 pounds. With the weirdness of the build-up out of the way, and Imavov making his 205-pound debut, the fight would finally happen. It was a rough fight for both fighters, but more specifically, Imavov. Strickland showed his fantastic jab and relentless front kicks to the body, which had Imavov confused on how to get past it without eating shots, and it would end up costing him the fight, because he would end up losing by unanimous decision and getting outclassed for all 5 rounds. Imavov had lost his win streak and got embarrassed, but that loss aged pretty well considering Strickland is widely considered to be one of the best middleweights in the world right now. Not to mention, he had dethroned the middleweight king, Israel Adesanya. Fast forward a month in June, Sean Strickland's former best friend would get matched up with Imavov, Chris Action Man Curtis. This was yet another huge test for Imavov, but he has never been known to back down from a scrap. It would turn out to be a great fight with Imavov looking like this was yet another huge test for him, but he has never been known to back down from a scrap. It would turn out to be a great fight with Imavov looking like he will get the decision or another TKO finish. But 3 minutes into the second round, they would clash heads, with Curtis taking the brunt of the collision. Therefore, it would get chalked down as a no contest. After that blunder, Imavov would take the rest of the year off and eventually fight again in February of 2024, when he would get matched up with Roman Dolidze, headlining his second card. This would be a close fight on paper, but once the fight happened, it was one-way traffic for Imavov. He would piece up Roman and dominate the clinch for all 5 rounds, and get awarded the majority decision. After winning his first main event, Imavov would waste no time in fighting again. This time, he would get a jump up in the rankings against former title challenger Jared Cannonier. This was a fantastic fight that showcased their power, cardio, and chins. But in the 4th round, Imavov had landed some clean shots that had Jared stumbling time after time, and eventually the ref would step in and stop the fight. Imavov would get a standing TKO finish. This was controversial because many people felt like Jared still had some fight in him, and Jared had started to get the momentum on his side before getting tagged. After the scrap with Jared, Imavov would face off with another prospect on the rise, Brandon All-In Allen. This was a fight the hardcore fans were hyped about, but drew little attention to the casual fan base. This would end up being a fun fight that left both men battered and bruised. While Imavov landed the better shots on the feet, he had a tough time getting into a dominant position on the ground. It would end up going to the judges, and Imavov would end up winning by unanimous decision. Overall, Imavov has a record of 14 wins and 4 losses. He has 6 knockouts, 4 submissions, and 5 decision wins, leaving him with a 57% finishing rate, which is all around pretty average. He has been submitted 1 time and has lost 3 decisions. Now it is time to break down the rise and fall, and the potential rise again of Israel Adesanya, also known as Izzy, as well as the last style bender. Israel was born in Nigeria but was raised in Auckland, New Zealand. He stands very tall for middleweight, being 6'4", and is at the latter end of his physical prime, with him being 35 years old. He also trains at one of the best gyms, City Kickboxing in New Zealand. Israel has had a very long and successful combat sports career. I'll quickly go over his stats in boxing and kickboxing, but we will focus on MMA because that is the focus of this video. Izzy has had 6 boxing fights, 5 wins and 1 loss. He has had 80 kickboxing fights, 75 wins and 5 losses, with 29 of those fights being knockouts. Now, let's rewind to the beginning of his MMA journey. Israel had his one and only amateur fight in MMA in November of 2009, which Izzy lost by decision, so he decided to go back to kickboxing and boxing. Fast forward to 2012, he would attempt to try this MMA thing again. His pro MMA debut was against James Griffiths. Izzy would dominate this fight, knocking his opponent out just 2 minutes into the first round. Needless to say, Israel was riding high and wanted to get another fight in. So in June of 2013, he would make his second walk into the octagon, this time fighting John Vake. And once again, Israel would steamroll his opponent, knocking him out just 4 minutes into the first round. Israel would take a year off and fight again in August of 2015, going up against a future UFC fighter, Kaan Song. And Israel would make Song look like he didn't belong in the octagon with him, because he would knock Song out just 1 minute into the first round. Israel was finishing everyone, so he would fight again just a month later in September of that same year, this time fighting Moi Tuigamala. This fight wouldn't end as fast as his previous ones, but he would still get a finish in the second round. Israel was starting to look unstoppable, so he would fight again just 2 weeks later, this time fighting Gale King. And Israel would not disappoint, knocking Gale out in the second round. Israel would take the rest of the year off to focus on his craft and improve at incorporating his striking into MMA. In January of 2016, Israel would fight again, and he would face off with Vladimir Katilin. This was a one-sided fight, eventually ending in a doctor stoppage, awarding Israel with a TKO win in the second round. Israel would jump right back into training camp and fight again in March, this time fighting Damir Zagirov. Once again, Israel would continue his finishing streak, knocking Zagirov out in the second round. Just 2 months later, Israel would make that walk again, facing off with Andrew Flores Smith, who would beat Smith from pillar to post, forcing Smith's corner to throw in the towel in between rounds 1 and 2. Just 2 weeks later, he would fight again, this time going up against Murad Magomedov. You won't guess how Israel won this fight. That's right, Israel would knock out Murad in the second round. Israel would take the rest of the year off to enjoy his success and further improve his game, as well as ponder what avenue to take as far as promotions. So he would stay close to home and fight in the AFC, also known as the Australian Fighting Championship. He would get the opportunity to fight a former UFC fighter, and at one point, a fan favorite, Melvin Gillard. He would fight Melvin in July of 2017. He would end up making short work of the veteran and knock him out in the first round. Israel would make the walk again in November of that same year, this time fighting in the Hex Fight Series. He would be fighting Stuart Dare, and once again, Dare would be no match for the style bender, because he would connect his chin to his chin and flatline Dare in the first round. Israel had an unreal amount of hype at this point, and the UFC would take notice, so they signed Israel, and we would see just how good he really was. In February of 2018, Israel would make his highly anticipated UFC debut, fighting Rob Wilkinson. Wilkinson showed his toughness, but he would eventually take too much damage and the ref would step in, leading Israel to continue his finishing streak and his undefeated record. Just a few months later, Israel would face off with Italian fan favorite with one of the best chins in the UFC, the Italian Dream, Marvin Vettori. This would be a very hard fight for both men. Marvin would put on a good performance, but Israel landed the better shots, as well as showcased his fantastic takedown defense. But at the end of the fight, Israel won by split decision, making this the first fight to see the judges. Israel would fight a ranked fighter just 3 months later. This fighter would be an extremely experienced fighter in the main event, Brad Tavares. Tavares would also be a very durable fighter, but Israel showed the fans his cardio and just how good his defense was, as well as just how good his counters were. This scrap would go all 5 rounds, and Israel was awarded the unanimous decision. Israel had an insane amount of hype, as more and more fans had seen his highlights and noticed his insane combat sports resume. So the UFC would continue to push him, and in November of 2018, Israel would face a very good grappler, Derek Brunson. This was his hardest fight on paper, but in classic Israel fashion, he would counter the daylights out of Brunson. and would land a picture-perfect knee, while Brunson shot for a sloppy takedown. This would have Brunson stumbling into the canvas, and Israel would hit him with a few shots, forcing the ref to step in. And in the first round, Israel would get the knockout. With all the momentum and hype on his side, he would fight a Hall of Famer and one of the best middleweight champions of all time, Anderson Silva. Both warriors would show a ton of respect and speak about how this was a proverbial passing of the torch. And it would turn out to be just that, because Israel would beat Silva by unanimous decision. And they both showed a ton of respect after the fight as well. With Israel's dream fight out of the way, he would finally get the opportunity to fight for the interim belt against another fan favorite, Kelvin Gastelum. This would turn out to be one of the best fights of all time, with Israel getting rocked extremely badly and almost getting knocked out with Kelvin's head kick. Israel would regroup, entering the 5th round with the scorecards having it 2-2. And in the 5th round, he would dominate a tired Kelvin and raining ground and pound shots until the final bell. Israel had won by unanimous decision and became the interim champion. In October of 2019, Israel would fight for the undisputed championship belt. Robert the Reaper Whittaker was the champion, and Israel would make short and easy work of Whittaker, getting the undisputed championship belt wrapped around his waist. He would take the rest of the year off and recover, and in March of 2020, he would take the rest of the year off and recover, and in March of 2020, Israel would fight a freak of nature, Yoel Romero. This was a fight all of the fans wanted to see, but unfortunately, this would turn out to be one of the most boring fights of all time, with both men barely throwing shots and both waiting for the opportunity to counter. But Israel had done enough to get the unanimous decision, getting his first title defense. So, in September of 2020, he would fight his biggest rival, Paulo Costa. This would not disappoint because Israel would showcase why he was the best in the division, knocking Paulo out cold in the 2nd round. With Israel's stardom and how active he was, since entering the promotion, the UFC would give him the opportunity to become double champion, fighting the light heavyweight champion Jan Blachowicz. And in March 2021, he would have that shot. But Jan was a very big and very strong fighter, out-muscling Israel and taking him down time and time again. Eventually, the fight would end with Israel on the wrong end of a unanimous decision, making this his first loss in the UFC. This wasn't his only loss, because he had also lost in kickboxing and boxing. Not only that, but he had been knocked out, so this wasn't a shock for him. There was one of his former opponents making his come up as well, the Italian Dream, Marvin Vettori. This was a huge fight because Marvin was as tough as they come. They would fight in June of 2021, and this was a hard fight but a dominant fight for Israel, beating Marvin by unanimous decision. Israel was quickly becoming one of the best middleweight champions the UFC has seen since Anderson Silva, and he would get a rematch with Robert Whittaker in February of 2022. This wouldn't be as easy of a win like the last time they fought. It would be a back and forth fight, with some fans feeling like Whittaker did enough to win, but the judges saw it differently, awarding Israel a unanimous decision. Israel would continue to be very active and fight again in a few months, in July of that same year, this time getting a fresh matchup with Jared Cannonier. This was a fun matchup on paper, but the fight wouldn't go that way. It was a one-sided fight with Israel beating Cannonier by unanimous decision, while also not being very entertaining. But Israel was still on a crazy pace. In just 2 years, he had 8 title fights and defended his belt 5 times. But there was a killer in the shadows. One of Israel's very first rivals in kickboxing, Alex Poatan Piedra. In the past, Israel had lost to Alex 2 times. This was an extremely hyped up fight, and it would not disappoint. And in November 2022, Israel would attempt to settle the score. At the beginning, Israel was on pace to do just that, until Alex hit Israel with a huge shot, sending him into the fence. Alex would pounce on the opportunity and continue to land big shots until the ref stepped in to stop the fight. Israel had been finished for the first time in MMA and had taken his first loss at middleweight. But again, Israel has gotten knocked out in kickboxing, so this wasn't his first rodeo. Israel would attempt to get his belt back in April of 2023, having his 4th fight with Alex in his career, and his 2nd fight with Alex in MMA. So this was one of the most hyped up fights of the year, and Israel would finally get redemption, beating Alex in the 2nd round after pretending to be hurt worse than he was, sending Alex to go for the finish, and Israel would counter with a huge shot, this time knocking Alex out cold and getting the win he wanted most, righting the losses that had been haunting his career. Many fans wanted Israel to give Alex another title shot, but Alex wanted to move up to light heavyweight because making the weight for middleweight was very hard to do. So Israel would be matched up to fight Dricus du Plessis, but Dricus would have to pull out, and Israel would fight Sean Strickland instead. At the time, everybody thought Strickland would get beaten badly by Israel, but this is the sport of MMA, and at the end of the day, it's a fight. And Strickland would remind everyone of that. After dropping Israel with a strong straight and continuing to dominate after that, he would shock the world and claim the belt. Israel had lost his belt 2 times now, and he wanted some time off to spend with his family and friends and enjoy the fruits of his labor. So he would take the rest of 2023 off and most of 2024, his longest layoff in his combat sports career. While Israel was relaxing and enjoying his break, Sean had fought Dricus du Plessis, and Sean had been dethroned. Now Dricus is champion, and Israel was the contender, the opposite of how their first fight was supposed to be. With all of the trash talk and bad blood brewing, this was a highly anticipated fight, but when the time would come to throw down in the octagon, only one man can win. It would be a back and forth battle with Israel winning some exchanges and DDP winning some as well. People were sweating and waiting for a big shot to send the other tumbling into the canvas, but it would not end in a knockout, surprisingly, or a decision. But in the 4th round, Israel had been submitted with a rear naked choke, losing the grudge match, and losing his shot at reclaiming the belt. And that brings us to this weekend. Israel will be facing off with Nassourdine Imavov. Israel's MMA record stands at 24 wins and 4 losses. Israel's MMA record stands at 24 wins and 5 losses. He has had 16 knockout wins, 8 decision wins. He has been submitted once and knocked out 1 time in MMA, and he has also lost 2 decisions. That leaves him with a pretty solid 67% finishing rate, with all of them being knockouts. Right now, I'm predicting that Imavov will have a great game plan and tries to get Izzy on the cage and tire him out, because Israel likes to back up very close to the cage. And I think that will lead Imavov to be able to trip Israel or go for a takedown against the fence. I don't think that this will be a super fun fight to watch, but Imavov is good enough defensively to where he can beat Israel if he doesn't try to stand and bang with Izzy. But it is also very possible for Izzy to stop the takedowns and keep the fight where he wants it. And that makes this a very interesting fight that could either be a snoozer or it could be an absolute barn burner. But I think it'll end in a decision with Imavov getting his hand raised. Let me know who you have winning this phenomenal fight. If you watched the video this far, power slap that like button and subscribe, as it is the only way to support the channel. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, have a great week, and enjoy the fights this weekend. Bye.